The emergency room clock struck 4 a.m., its ticking louder than the beeping monitors that framed my fragile body. Bright fluorescent lights glared down with surgical cruelty, showing every bruise, every blue tint on my skin, every trace of frost clinging to my hair like shards of broken glass. Nurses rushed around to their sneakers, squeaking on the polished floor, their hands moving faster than my heart could beat. Dr. Evelyn Harper's voice cut through the chaos, sharp but trembling. She was gone 2 full minutes. Survival like this almost never happens. The word gone echoed in the sterile air like a bell tolling at a funeral. My chest had been a flat line, my lungs still my body a shell. They shocked me back, not once, not twice, but 3 times before my pulse clawed its way into existence again. I should not have been there. Yet I was alive against all odds, with lips cracked from cold and bloodied fingers trembling under the weight of an oxygen mask. But the miracle of survival was not the real story. The real story was why I had died in the first place. Hours earlier, I had felt my brother's hand around my wrist, the grip iron tight, leaving purple bruises that even the cold could not numb. David's voice spat venom inches from my ear. "Are you trying to poison me with this soup, Clara?" His face, twisted in rage veins throbbing at his temple, looked like a stranger, though he had been my brother all my life. I tried to explain. It was just a little spice, but words never mattered in that house. Margaret, our mother, stood in the hallway, her arms crossed, her gaze colder than the winter wind outside. "Apologize to your brother, Clara," she ordered, as if my existence was the crime. My refusal to bow made David explode. He yanked me down the stairs, my knees slamming against the steps, my cries bouncing off the walls no one cared to hear. The garage smelled of oil and rust, the air heavy with silence except for my ragged breathing. Then I saw at the walk-in freezer a steel beast looming in the corner, something our father once bought for his failed catering dream. The handle gleamed in the dim light, and dread spread through me faster than the cold air that leaked from its seams. David wrenched the door open, the icy fog rolling out like the breath of death itself. "No, please, David," I begged, but mercy had no home in his eyes. He shoved me with both hands, my body crashing onto the frozen floor, the impact stealing my breath. I scrambled up, sprinted toward the door, but in a second it slammed with a deafening clang that sealed my fate. Then came the sound that will never leave me, the metallic snap of the padlock clicking shut on the outside, final cruel, a sound heavier than a coffin lid closing. I pounded on the steel until my fists broke open smears of red, staining the frost the color stark against the white. The cold seeped through my skin, a thief stealing warmth cell by cell. My screams echoed hollow and unanswered, my voice shattering as tears froze on my cheeks. Outside, muffled, I heard Margaret's voice, steady, unfeeling. Maybe this will teach her. My own mother choosing discipline over my life. Minutes turned to eternities. My breath came in jagged gasps, each one fogging the air before vanishing like hope. My teeth clattered so hard they felt like they might crack. My muscles convulsed violently, then slower, weaker, until even shivering abandoned me. My skin burned with a paradoxical fire, the cruel trick of hypothermia, telling me I was burning while I was freezing to death. I pressed my face against the steel door, my eyelids heavy, whispering to no one. Would anyone care if I never came back? Images flashed like lightning. Birthdays where David grinned over cake while I scrubbed plates. School nights where Margaret hissed that I was ungrateful. Evenings where I cooked meal after meal, hoping for approval that never came. All those moments collided into one truth. I had been invisible all my life, useful only as long as I served. My body slid to the floor, limbs, stiff breath, shallow. The pounding stopped because I no longer had the strength to lift my hands. Silence wrapped around me tighter than the cold, and in that silence, darkness. When the paramedics broke in hours later, they found me sprawled on the freezer floor, skin ashen lips, blue eyes closed, as if I had already left this world. My heart had stopped, my body was unresponsive. To them, I was just another body until the ER fought with fire and wires to steal me back from the edge. They shocked me again and again until the monitor flickered and beeped and gasps filled the room. Against medicine, against reason, against probability, my heart found rhythm. My eyes cracked open under the fluorescent glare, and my lips parted around the oxygen mask, whispering words that froze the room more than the freezer had. They tried to kill me. Nurses glanced at each other, startled. Harper leaned in, her voice gentler now. Clara, you survived what should not be survivable. Do you understand that? I nodded weakly, though every nerve screamed with pain. I understood all too well. My death had been written by the very people meant to protect me, and my survival, miraculous or not, was no gift, it was a responsibility. Because the truth was bigger than me, and I knew it. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the obedient sister. I was the woman who had been locked in the cold, who had frozen to death and clawed back, who would no longer stay silent. For the first time in 26 years, my story had to be told, not whispered, not excused, not buried under family loyalty. At 4 a.m. in that ER, while machines breathed for me and doctors called it a miracle, I realized something else. This was only the beginning. From the outside, the Mitchell house looked like the picture of suburban respectability. A neat lawn trimmed every Saturday by my brother, a garden Margaret liked to brag about, though I was the one who planted the roses and weeded the soil, a driveway where David's truck gleamed under the sun. Neighbors saw a family that appeared ordinary, maybe even enviable. They did not see what happened once the doors closed. I grew up in that house like a shadow, learning early that silence kept the peace, learning that my needs were always second to someone else's. My brother David, 4 years older, had always been the favored one, the golden child whose temper was excused as passion, whose cruelty was dismissed as a joke. I still remember being 10 years old, clutching my drawing from school with pride only for David to snatch it, crumple it, and laugh, while Margaret scolded me for tattling instead of him for destroying. "Clara," she said with a sigh, "you need to learn not to provoke your brother." That sentence became the refrain of my life. Everything David did was my fault somehow. If he shoved me, it was because I had annoyed him. If he yelled, it was because I had said the wrong thing. If he broke something, it was because I had distracted him. Margaret built a wall of excuses around him so thick that no blame could ever stick. It was easier for her to gaslight me than to admit her perfect son was dangerous. By the time I was 13, I understood my role. I was the scapegoat, the invisible servant, the one who smoothed over chaos so David could shine. When he wanted food, I cooked. When he wanted clean clothes, I folded. When he wanted space, I disappeared. Margaret encouraged it, praising me when I made life easier for her son, criticizing me when I asked for anything in return. David's violence was not sudden, it was cultivated. At 15, he shoved me into the yard for forgetting to iron his shirt. Margaret glanced out the window and then pulled the curtain closed, muttering that I should toughen up. At 17, during a family barbecue, David snapped a spatula in half and threw it at me, the metal edge cutting my arm, while relatives laughed it off as sibling roughhousing. No one asked if I was hurt. No one wanted to see. I learned to hide bruises under long sleeves, to press ice packs in secret, to cry into my pillow where no one would hear. School became my only refuge, and even there I carried the weight of my family's judgment. Margaret insisted I join home economics so I could be a proper caretaker, reminding me that cooking was the only real skill a girl like me needed. It was in those classes that I discovered I had talent in the kitchen, a gift for flavors and textures. Cooking could have been my escape, something beautiful that belonged to me, but in the Mitchell house even that was twisted. My dishes became expectations, not expressions. Margaret began demanding I prepare dinners that mirrored her standards. David criticized every bite as if he were a food critic, and I was trapped in an endless cycle of servitude. Each plate I served was another piece of my spirit handed over without thanks. At 19, I thought about leaving. I even packed a small bag once my savings tucked into an envelope, my college application half filled on the desk. But Margaret found it, her eyes narrowing with cold fire. "You would abandon your family," she hissed, "when we have done everything for you." She tore the application in front of me, shredded my hope with her manicured nails, and said, "Without us, you are nothing." The words sank deep, cementing a belief that had been drilled into me since childhood. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was nothing without them. I stayed. At 21, I got my first part-time job at a cafe downtown, a sliver of independence that felt like oxygen. I loved the rhythm of clinking cups, the smell of espresso, the chatter of strangers who knew nothing about my scars. But David came one night, stormed in furious that I had missed dinner, dragged me outside by the arm in front of my coworkers. Margaret defended him again. She told the manager I was irresponsible, that my brother was just protecting me, and I lost the job the next day. Independence was not allowed. Every attempt I made to step into the world alone was sabotaged, every seed of freedom crushed before it could sprout. David grew more domineering as he aged, his body heavier, his voice louder, his rages more unpredictable. Margaret grew more manipulative, twisting every incident into my fault. She would smile sweetly to outsiders, compliment David's achievements, and then turn to me at home and remind me how ungrateful I was. If I spoke up, I was dramatic. If I stayed quiet, I was weak. There was no winning. What I remember most are the silences. The heavy silences after fights where my body ached and my mind screamed, but the house carried on as if nothing had happened. Margaret would hum while folding laundry. David would watch television, and I would retreat to my room, clutching the walls, whispering into my pillow. "You are not crazy. You are not crazy." Because gaslighting is not just words, it is a slow erosion of reality until you doubt your own memory, your own pain, your own worth. My identity shrank. By 25, I was not living, I was surviving. I cooked, I cleaned. I absorbed blows, both verbal and physical, and I told myself that enduring was strength. But inside, a quiet rebellion grew. Every insult planted a seed, every shove watered it. Every cold glance from Margaret nourished it. I began to write small notes in a hidden journal, notes that reminded me I existed beyond their abuse. You are Clara Mitchell. You are not just their scapegoat. You deserve to live. Those words became my anchor, though I never showed them to anyone. My secret rebellion kept me alive in spirit even as my body was worn down. I sometimes dreamed of a life where my cooking could bring joy, where my name was not followed by criticism, where I could wake without fear. Dreams were dangerous in that house, but they were mine. Looking back from the hospital bed where I had returned from death, I realized the freezer was not a sudden act of violence. It was the culmination of years of contempt, years of unchecked rage, years of Margaret's complicity. David did not just decide one night to kill me. He had been preparing me for that freezer all along, and Margaret had been paving the way with her silence and excuses. The past was not just memory, it was evidence, a record of a toxic home that had been allowed to fester unchecked. And though I had survived that night, I now knew survival was no longer enough. I had lived in their shadow long enough. The girl who grew up unseen had died in that freezer, and the woman who walked out of the ER was someone new, someone who would not allow the past to remain hidden any longer. The night it all unraveled did not begin like a horror story. It began like every other evening in the Mitchell house, the smell of simmering broth wafting from the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of the evening news echoing from the living room where Margaret sat, her feet tucked neatly under her on the sofa. I stood at the stove, stirring the soup, a recipe I had tweaked after years of experimenting, a dish meant to be warm and comforting against the bitter winter outside. A touch of cayenne, just enough to add warmth, not burn. Cooking was my last refuge, the only place where I felt in control, where each spice and ingredient answered to me and not to my family's whims. But that illusion shattered the moment David stormed in. He was already half drunk. I could smell the beer on his breath, see the redness in his cheeks, the twitch in his jaw that warned of a storm. He slammed his hand down on the counter, making the ladle jump from the pot and splash broth onto the stove. "What the hell is this, Clara?" he barked, his eyes narrowing as if I had served him poison. "Just dinner," I whispered, trying to steady my voice. "Just soup." He scooped up a spoonful and slurped it, then spat it into the sink with theatrical disgust. "Too spicy." "You trying to poison me?" His voice boomed through the house like thunder. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face pinched with annoyance not at him, but at me. Clara, apologize to your brother, she said calmly, as though my cooking had been an act of war. I shook my head, my heart hammering. It is not too spicy, I said softly. It is the same recipe I have made for years. The refusal ignited something dark in David. His eyes flared, his nostrils flared, and the vein at his temple throbbed like it might burst. He stepped closer until his shadow swallowed mine, until I could smell the alcohol soaked into his pores. Apologize, he growled, or you will regret it. I looked to Margaret, desperate for intervention, for the smallest shred of protection, but she only crossed her arms, her lips curling into that familiar disapproving frown. Do not antagonize him, Clara. You always take things too far. My stomach sank. I realized then that no matter what I said, I was already guilty. The silence stretched taut like a rope about to snap until David grabbed the bowl of soup and hurled it against the wall. It shattered into a spray of broth and porcelain shards that rained down on the tile. The sound made me flinch, but I did not move. He took my stillness as defiance. You think you can disrespect me? His voice cracked raw with fury. My hands trembled as I reached for a towel to clean the mess, hoping the gesture of submission would calm him, but he struck the towel from my hand. The rage in his face was not about soup. It was about control, about reminding me where I stood. Margaret's eyes darted from the wall to me, her voice sharper now. Clara, just apologize. Stop making this worse. Her tone was weary, as though she had seen this play out too many times and always expected the same ending, me surrendering him victorious. I swallowed hard tears burning at the corners of my eyes, but the words would not come. Something inside me had shifted. For the first time, I felt the truth in my bones that my life was more fragile than I had ever admitted. If I kept giving in one day, there would be nothing left of me to give. My silence enraged David further. He lunged, grabbing my wrist so hard I cried out, his fingers digging deep enough to leave marks that would bloom purple by morning. I tried to pull back, but he was stronger, his grip iron. He leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. You think you are better than me, little sister. You think your food makes you someone. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs, because I understood now that this was not about soup. It never was. It was about my very existence, threatening his dominance about a life where I dared to be more than invisible. Margaret's voice floated over sharp and cold. Clara, stop being dramatic. Just say you are sorry. I looked at her, my mother, my supposed protector, and all I saw was complicity. She was not shocked. She was not afraid. She was simply inconvenienced by the conflict. That was the moment dread sank into me like ice. They would let this go as far as David wanted. They would let him destroy me if it kept their world intact. My knees shook as he released me with a shove that sent me stumbling against the counter. My breath came in ragged gasps, my mind racing. The cayenne in the soup had been a spark, but what I felt now was a wildfire. Fear, yes, but also something else. A grim certainty that I was no longer safe in my own home. The realization cut sharper than any shard of broken bowl. This was not just a bad night, not just another rage. This was the moment I understood he could kill me, and Margaret would still ask me to apologize. The tension lingered even as David stormed out of the kitchen, muttering curses, his heavy steps shaking the floor. Margaret lingered, her eyes cold, her voice low. You never learn, Clara. You push and push until he has no choice. My throat closed. My mother had just justified his violence as inevitable, as if I had written the script myself. Alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the smell of burnt cayenne and the shards of shattered porcelain, I sank to my knees and pressed my bleeding hands against the floor. My breath shuddered. My tears fell silently, and I whispered to the empty air, "He will kill me one day." The house seemed to listen, its walls heavy with silence, its shadows pressing in closer, as if they too knew the truth. For the first time, I believed my own words. The storm that had been brewing for years finally broke on that winter night. The day had been a blur of preparations, my hands raw from chopping vegetables, my back aching from hours bent over the stove. A family dinner was planned, not 30 people, but enough to satisfy Margaret's obsession with appearances, and I had worked myself into exhaustion to make it flawless. By the time the guests were expected, snow had begun to fall outside the cold, seeping in through the garage door. I was setting trays of rolls on the counter when David's voice thundered through the house, his words slurred by beer but sharp with rage. "Clara, get down here now!" My stomach twisted. I wiped my flour-covered hands on my apron and stepped into the living room. He was pacing like a caged animal, his face flushed, his fists clenched. Margaret sat in her chair, calm as ever, a glass of wine in her hand. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He held up a spoonful of soup from the pot I had left simmering, his glare burning holes through me. "Still spicy, still poison. I told you to fix it." He threw the spoon into the sink with a clang that made me flinch. "It is fine," I whispered. "No one else thinks it is too spicy." His face twisted, and in a heartbeat he was across the room, his hand clamping onto my arm like a vice. "You do not talk back to me." He dragged me toward the garage, my feet stumbling to keep up my breath caught in my throat. Margaret's voice followed cool and detached. "Maybe this will teach her." My heart pounded against my ribs as he shoved me through the doorway, the bitter cold rushing in from the unheated garage. The walk-in freezer stood in the corner, a relic from Margaret's insistence on bulk storage, a steel box meant for meat and supplies but now looming like a coffin. David yanked the heavy door open, the hinges groaning, the icy air spilling out. "No," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "Please, David, do not." He laughed a low sound that chilled me more than the air. "Maybe you will learn respect in the cold." He shoved me inside my body, colliding with the metal wall, the shock of it rattling my bones. I spun around in panic, but the door slammed shut and I heard the click of a padlock sliding into place on the outside. The sound was final, a death sentence. My fists pounded against the steel, my voice hoarse as I screamed. "Let me out! Please!" My knuckles split open against the unyielding metal blood smearing across the frost. I could see my breath clouding in front of me, could feel the air tightening around my chest as the temperature gnawed at my skin. Outside, muffled through the door, I heard Margaret's voice detached and cold. "Maybe this will finally teach her a lesson." The words sliced through me deeper than the cold. My mother, my own mother, had chosen to stand with him to watch me freeze. Panic surged raw and primal. I pounded until my arms ached, until the sting of torn skin sent shocks of pain up my wrists. The freezer hummed with mechanical indifference, the walls glistening with frost, the air biting harder with every passing second. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear footsteps, a key turning anything that meant mercy, but there was nothing, only silence. My body began to betray me. The shivering started violently, uncontrollable tremors that rattled my teeth. My breath came in ragged bursts, fogging the air, dampening my hair with frozen mist. My fingers numbed, my toes ached, and every inhale felt like knives in my lungs. I staggered to the corner, sliding down against the frozen wall, clutching my arms around myself. Memories blurred with the present voices from years past mixing with the hum of the freezer. "You push him too far, Clara. You never learn. Without us, you are nothing." Maybe they had been preparing me for this all along, every insult and shove building toward this one final act. My vision blurred. The pounding in my chest slowed, heavy and uneven. I tried to keep my eyes open to cling to consciousness, but the cold pulled at me, whispering promises of relief if I just let go. My lips cracked, my throat burned, but still I whispered into the frozen air. "I do not deserve this. Please, someone. Please." Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours passed, I could not tell. My hands bled where they had struck the steel red streaks, staining the white frostproof that I had fought, that I had not gone quietly. My body curled tighter, instinct trying to conserve what little warmth remained. At some point, I stopped shivering, and that scared me most of all. The cold was no longer sharp. It was heavy, wrapping around me like a blanket, pulling me into darkness. I thought of Uncle Robert, his kind eyes, his voice telling me once that I deserved more than this. I thought of freedom of a life where I was more than a servant or a scapegoat. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who wrote notes in secret, saying, "You are Clara Mitchell. You deserve to live." And then I thought nothing at all. My heart stuttered, my lungs faltered, and the world went black. On the other side of that steel door, my family carried on. Margaret poured another glass of wine. David paced with satisfaction. The house was warm and bright while I lay dying in the cold. The silence of the freezer was absolute until my own body broke it. The weak thud of my heartbeat slowing, the rasp of my breath turning shallow, the scrape of my nails dragging across steel as if carving proof that I had been here. My consciousness drifted in and out, the line between nightmare and reality blurring. At one moment, I was curled in the corner staring at my frozen breath clouding like smoke in front of me. At another, I was a child again, hiding in the closet while David pounded on the door and Margaret told me to stop being dramatic. The cold stole time, stole thought, stole me. When the darkness finally wrapped around my mind, it was almost a relief. No more shivering, no more begging. Only a stillness that felt final. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the muffled sound of voices. My body was too weak to respond, my lips too frozen to form words, but a faint part of me hoped. In the house next door, the Millers had been awake, restless in the storm. Mr. Miller had gone to the garage for firewood when he heard the strange rhythmic pounding from our side, followed by silence. He told his wife something was wrong, that the Mitchell garage sounded like it was alive. At first, Mrs. A. Miller hesitated. They knew the Mitchell family knew David's temper, knew Margaret's sharp tongue. But the sound was too strange, too wrong. At 12:15 a.m., she dialed 911. I never heard the sirens when they came. I was too far gone, my body too still. The officers forced the side door open, the bitter cold rushing at them. Flashlights swept across the garage, catching on the steel door of the walk-in freezer. The padlock gleamed in the light. They called my name, though I could not answer. One officer struck the lock with his baton, while another fetched bolt cutters. It took minutes, though to them it must have felt longer. The door finally swung open, releasing a cloud of frost, and the broken figure of me crumpled on the floor, skin-blue lips, cracked blood, frozen to the walls where my fists had struck. They pulled me out, and one officer cursed under his breath. "She is gone. Get EMS now." At 1:05 a.m., the ambulance lights painted the snow red and blue. They worked frantically over me, their hands pressing, rubbing, calling my name. They cut through my frozen clothes, attaching leads, searching for a pulse that flickered like a candle in the wind. At 1:40 a.m., I reached the emergency room. Dr. Evelyn Harper was waiting. Years of practice had given her a steady calm, but she later admitted her heart dropped when she saw me. Core temperature dangerously low, heart barely registering. They began the protocols: warm IV fluids, heated blankets, chest compressions. At one point, my heart flatlined. For 2 minutes, the monitor sang that unbroken tone, and everyone in the room thought it was over. Dr. Harper pressed harder, her voice steady, even as she knew how rare survival was. "Come on, Clara, come back." Against the odds, a weak rhythm sparked back to life. A ripple of disbelief ran through the team. She is back, barely, but back. When my eyes fluttered open near 4 a.m., the first thing I saw was the blur of lights above me, then Dr. Harper's face leaning close. "You were gone," she whispered, her voice a mixture of awe and exhaustion. "You should not be here, but you are. It is a miracle." The words anchored me, tethered me to the world again. My lips trembled as I tried to speak, and a single hoarse whisper escaped. "They tried to kill me." Dr. Harper froze, understanding the weight of the words. She nodded slowly, signaling to a nurse to write it down. My survival was not an accident, it was a testimony. Hours later, Margaret and David arrived at the hospital, their faces masks of concern for the staff to see, but behind their eyes flickered annoyance, panic. They claimed I had been careless, that I must have locked myself in by mistake while fetching supplies. They spoke as if it were clumsy, a silly mishap. Dr. Harper listened, her professional expression unreadable, but she knew what she had seen. No one climbs into a freezer and padlocks themselves from the outside. The police officer on duty, Detective Laura Collins, also listened. She had seen family cover-ups before, had heard excuses that never matched reality. She wrote down every word. In my hospital bed, every breath hurt my body wrapped in warmth that did not feel like mine. My hands were bandaged, the skin raw from where I had beaten against steel. My throat ached with each attempt at words, but the truth boiled beneath the surface waiting to be spoken. For now, I was alive. Barely, but alive. The miracle of survival made the cruelty sharper. They had left me to die, my brother with his rage, my mother with her silence. The freezer had been their weapon, but fate, neighbors, and a doctor's persistence had pulled me back. At dawn, through the hospital window, I saw the first light of morning touch the snow outside. It felt unreal that I could witness it again, that my eyes could still see anything at all. The machines beeped. The nurses moved quietly. Doctor. Harper checked my vitals again and met my gaze. You need to rest, she said gently. But her eyes carried another message. You need to fight. The night had nearly claimed me, but morning had returned me. The truth was no longer hidden. It pulsed in every bruise, every cut, every frostbitten inch of me. I knew then that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something neither David nor Margaret could control. The freezer had failed to silence me. My voice was still here, and it would be heard. The days that followed in the hospital blurred together like snow melting into slush. But within that haze, I began to feel something new. I had been through hell, my body reduced to a fragile shell, but my mind somehow was sharper than ever. Survival had ignited a fire inside me. It was no longer enough to endure to keep my head down to hope the storm would pass. The freezer had taught me one undeniable truth. If I stayed silent, they would try again, and one day I would not walk out alive. Margaret visited first. She swept into the room with a bouquet of lilies, the picture of maternal concern for anyone watching. But the way she leaned in close, her voice like steel beneath sugar, told the real story. You must not make this into something it is not, Clara. People are already whispering, you know how careless you can be. Her words made my stomach churn because even now, after nearly watching me die, she dared to twist reality. I stared back at her bandages covering my hands, the monitors beeping softly at my side. I said nothing because I was learning that silence could be its own weapon. She shifted uncomfortably under my gaze, then sighed. If you insist on telling wild stories, it will destroy this family. Think about David. Think about me. Think about our name. Her audacity sparked rage in my chest. For years, I had thought of their name, their comfort, their image. It had cost me my childhood, my peace, almost my life. I would think of them no longer. That night, as the hospital halls grew quiet and the nurses dimmed the lights, I overheard voices outside my room. Margaret and David huddled together, whispering too loudly. If she talks? David muttered, we're finished. She won't. Margaret replied, she knows better. The words sank into me like nails. They were already plotting to bury me under their lies. My fingers itched for proof, for something undeniable. I reached for the small recorder app on my phone tucked beneath my pillow. My hands shook as I pressed record, capturing every poisonous word. It was not much, but it was the start of my war. The next morning, Detective Laura Collins stopped by. She was calm, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who had seen through countless false smiles. She asked routine questions. Did I remember what happened, how I ended up in the freezer, whether I had locked myself in by mistake? My lips were dry, my throat sore, but I managed to whisper, he locked me in. David locked me in, and my mother let him. Collins studied me in silence for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We will look into that, she said. Her eyes told me she believed more than her words allowed. After she left, I felt a flicker of something I had not felt in years, validation. Someone had heard me, someone who mattered. Still, I knew whispers and suspicions would not be enough. Margaret and David were skilled manipulators, and the community saw them as respectable, even generous. I needed evidence that screamed the truth louder than any lie. That evening, Uncle Robert visited. He came quietly, his presence filling the room with warmth that Margaret never could. He took my hand gently, careful not to disturb the bandages. Clara, he said softly, I saw the news. They are saying it was an accident, but I do not believe that. I blinked back tears. Thank you, I whispered. He leaned closer, his voice steady. If you are ready to fight this, I will stand with you. My chest ached, but not from injury this time. It was the ache of hope. I told him everything, my voice trembling but clear. I told him about the soup, the freezer, Margaret's cold words, the recording I had captured. His jaw tightened as he listened, fury simmering beneath his calm. You cannot face this alone, he said firmly. We will show them who they really are. That night, with Robert's support, I began to form a plan. It started with gathering every piece of proof I could. The recording of their whispers, the photos of my bruises, the medical report Dr. Harper had written detailing frostbite and hypothermia that no accident could explain. Each piece was a stone in the foundation of my defense. Each piece was a step toward reclaiming my voice. Margaret returned the next morning, this time with David at her side. They both smiled too wide, their words dripping with false concern. Clara, David said smoothly, You scared us. You should have been more careful. I stared at him, my silence deliberate, my recorder hidden and running. Margaret touched my arm. Sweetheart, the police might ask questions. Just tell them you were tired, distracted. Tell them it was a mistake. I turned my head away, refusing her gaze. Her voice sharpened. If you betray this family, you will regret it. I felt my pulse race, but I did not let them see fear. I let the recorder capture every threat, every slip of truth. Later that day, Robert returned and I played it for him. His face hardened as the words filled the room. This is it, Clara, he said. This is the rope that will hang them. The thought of public exposure frightened me, but the freezer had left me with no illusions. Privacy had only ever protected them, not me. If I was to survive, the truth had to be seen. Over the next few days, with Robert's help, I prepared. He contacted a cousin willing to live-stream someone who could spread the truth beyond the walls of our family. He arranged a small gathering framed as a celebration of my survival. Margaret and David would not suspect too arrogant to imagine their secrets unraveling. Meanwhile, Dr. Harper visited again. She adjusted my IV, checked my vitals, then looked me in the eye. You know, she said softly, survival like yours almost never happens. Most do not make it out of that kind of cold. Her words sank deep, a reminder that my second chance was not something to waste. I nodded, my voice steadier than I felt. I am going to use it. She gave a small smile. Good, because people need to hear stories like yours. When the day of release came, Margaret signed the paperwork with a flourish, pretending to be the concerned mother. David hovered nearby, smug, as though my silence had been bought. They did not see the steel in my eyes, the determination in my breath. They thought I was still their ghost, still the invisible daughter. They had no idea I had returned from the freezer with fire in my veins. That night, back at Robert's house, where I would stay for safety, I lay awake, thinking of everything ahead. The lies, the confrontation, the risk of standing up to them. Fear pressed heavy, but beneath it was something stronger. Willpower, resistance. I had been locked in the cold, left for dead, but I had survived. Now it was their turn to face the freezing truth in public light. The night of the so-called celebration carried a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind. Robert had arranged everything with precision, disguising it as a simple dinner to welcome me back from the hospital. The invitations had been casual, just a handful of relatives and neighbors, enough to give the appearance of warmth, but not so many that suspicion would grow. Margaret and David accepted immediately, eager to reclaim control of the narrative. They thought this gathering would cement their version of events, where I had foolishly stumbled into danger and they had been burdened with the fallout. They had no idea that the very walls of Robert's house would bear witness to their unraveling. At 6 o'clock, the guests began to arrive, coats dusted with snow, smiles practiced for the occasion. Margaret swept in first, her perfume sharp, her voice carrying as though she were hosting in her own home. David followed close behind, shoulders squared, his eyes darting toward me with the smugness of a man who believed he had already won. I greeted them with a calmness that surprised even me. My scars were still visible, my hands still wrapped, but my gaze was steady. Good to see you up and about. Margaret said, her tone syrupy enough to choke me. I only nodded, hiding the recorder in my pocket, though by then I had far more powerful weapons than hidden audio. Dinner was simple but comforting dishes Robert and a few relatives had prepared. As we ate, I watched Margaret perform for the table, recounting how worried she had been, how thankful she felt that I had survived my own mistake. Every word was a dagger twisted with elegance. David chimed in occasionally, mocking in his casual remarks. "Families must stick together," he declared loudly, and everyone nodded, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. At 6:45, Robert stood tapping his glass. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight we honor Clara's recovery, but more importantly, we honor truth." A hush fell over the room. Margaret's smile faltered slightly, sensing a shift in tone. David leaned back in his chair, unconcerned. Robert continued, "Clara has something to share. Something you all deserve to hear." My heart pounded, but I rose my knees, trembling with both fear and determination. I met the eyes of every person in that room before I spoke. For years, I have carried the weight of silence. 2 weeks ago, that silence nearly killed me. And then I reached for the remote on the table. The TV flickered to life, the lights dimmed, and the first recording played. David's voice filled the room, low and menacing. "If she talks, we're finished." Gasps rippled through the guests. Margaret stiffened, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Another clip followed, her own voice, clear and cold. "If you betray this family, you will regret it." The room erupted in murmurs, shocked faces turning toward them. David shot up from his chair. "This is out of context," he barked. "Lies." Robert raised a hand. "Sit down, David. Let her finish." The next image flashed on the screen, photographs of my frostbitten hands, the bruises on my arms, the medical report signed by Dr. Harper herself. The words were undeniable injuries consistent with forced confinement in sub-zero temperatures. The chatter grew louder, anger mixing with disbelief. And then the final blow, a cousin at the far end of the table lifted his phone. He had been live streaming the entire moment. Hundreds of viewers had already tuned in, the numbers climbing by the second. Comments scrolled across the screen. "Lock him up! Poor Clara! How could a mother allow this?" Margaret's face drained of color. "Turn that off," she snapped. "This is family business." "No," I said firmly, my voice shaking but strong. "This is not just family business. This is attempted murder." The live stream continued, and within minutes it spread like wildfire. Shares, multiplied reactions poured in, people demanding justice. Reporters from the local paper who followed community streams picked it up almost immediately. By 8 o'clock, a local news crew had arrived outside Robert's house. The camera lights bathed the porch in a harsh glow as microphones thrust forward. Neighbors stepped up first, eager to speak. I heard the banging that night, Mr. Miller told the reporter, his voice steady. "It wasn't an accident," Mrs. Miller added quietly. "David's temper is not new. I've seen him shove Clara in the yard more than once." Each statement cracked the facade Margaret and David had built for years. Their respectability crumbled in real time, their lies dissolving under the weight of witnesses. Inside the live stream, audience surged. 10,000 shares, then 20. Comments flooded in. "I survived abuse too. Thank you for speaking. This is terrifying and brave." A smaller current of skepticism threaded through. "She should have left years ago. Why air family laundry online?" But the voices of support drowned them, a tidal wave of solidarity that lifted me higher than I had ever felt. Margaret tried once more to regain control. "This is manipulation," she cried, her voice breaking. "She is sick. She needs help." I looked directly into the camera. "I am not sick. I am a survivor." David lunged as if to snatch the phone, but Robert and 2 cousins blocked him, their faces grim. "Enough," Robert said. "You've had control long enough." The reporter outside caught the commotion, broadcasting it live on the evening segment. By 9 o'clock, my story was headline news. Local woman claims family tried to freeze her alive. Evidence live streamed. People across town gathered around televisions, scrolling on phones, shaking their heads at the horror unfolding from a home they thought they knew. The comments became more personal, more visceral. "Lock him away. No more excuses for family violence. Clara, we see you, we believe you." For the first time in my life, I felt the power of being seen not as an inconvenience, not as a scapegoat, but as a human being worthy of protection. Margaret sat frozen, her perfect facade shattered. David fumed, pacing like a trapped animal. The guests whispered among themselves, shifting their seats farther from the pair. The tide had turned. The cage that had held me for so long now closed around them. At 10 o'clock, the police arrived, drawn not only by the live stream, but by dozens of calls from concerned citizens who had watched in horror. Detective Collins stepped through the door, her expression unreadable, but her presence like a blade cutting through the chaos. She surveyed the room, the phones, the guests, the cameras, then turned her gaze on Margaret and David. "We'll need to talk," she said. Her words carried the weight of inevitability. Public revenge had been achieved. Their reputations lay in ruins, their secrets exposed to thousands, and the law was now circling. But more than that, the truth was out of my hands and into the world. No amount of gaslighting could drag it back into the shadows. I had taken the cold they tried to bury me in and turned it into a fire that burned their lies down in front of everyone. By the time the police cars pulled away from Robert's house that night, the street looked like a stage after a play the actors scattered, and the audience still buzzing about what they had witnessed. The live stream had not only reached thousands online, but had also been replayed on the evening news, complete with commentary from anchors who shook their heads in disbelief. For Margaret and David, the damage was irreversible, but for me, the night had only been the beginning of a long path toward justice. The next morning, the headlines plastered across local papers and online outlets were impossible to ignore. Woman claims brother locked her in freezer read one. Mother accused of cover-up declared another. My phone, still buzzing from the night before, filled with messages from strangers offering support and demanding accountability. The voices of doubt were there too. Of course, people saying, "I must be exaggerating that families have disagreements and I should not destroy mine." But the overwhelming response was one of outrage and solidarity. Detective Collins visited me at Robert's house before noon. She wore the same calm expression she had carried the first time, but there was no denying the shift in her tone. "We have enough to proceed," she said, setting a folder on the table. Inside were printouts, transcripts of the recordings, copies of Dr. Harper's medical report, screenshots of the live stream, and statements from neighbors. "David Mitchell is being charged with attempted murder. Margaret Mitchell will face charges of complicity and obstruction. The evidence is strong and the public pressure is even stronger." My breath caught at the words. Attempted murder. It was what I had always known in my bones, but hearing it confirmed by law carried a weight that nearly buckled me. Robert's hand covered mine, steadying me as Collins continued. "The prosecutor has already agreed to push this case forward. The attention makes it difficult for them to delay." That afternoon, the arrests were made official. Cameras followed as David was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted with rage, spitting words I could not hear over the shouting reporters. Margaret, by contrast, kept her head bowed, her expression blank, as though detachment could shield her from the humiliation. The images splashed across every news channel in the county, replayed until even people who had never heard our name before were whispering about the Mitchell family's fall from grace. At the hospital, Dr. Harper was asked to provide a formal statement. Her words became another nail in the coffin of their defense. Her survival was extraordinary, she told reporters. "These injuries are not consistent with an accident. They reflect forced confinement, prolonged exposure to extreme cold, and trauma to the hands and arms from striking a hard surface repeatedly." The authority of her voice silenced many of the remaining skeptics. Within days, the story spread beyond our town. National outlets picked it up as a cautionary tale of hidden abuse within families that seemed perfect from the outside. Talk shows debated whether justice would truly be served. Advocates for survivors used my case as proof of how dangerous silence can be. The momentum was frightening at times, but it also carried me like a current I had no choice but to ride. Meanwhile, Margaret and David scrambled to defend themselves. Their lawyers attempted to argue that the recordings were manipulated, that my injuries could have been self-inflicted, that I had orchestrated the spectacle for attention. but the viral clip of them threatening me, combined with the neighbor's testimony, made their claims sound desperate. When one of Margaret's friends was interviewed and admitted that she had often heard her complain about how Clara needed to be taught lessons, the defense began to crumble further. The preliminary hearing took place 3 weeks later. I sat in the courtroom, my hands still healing, my heart pounding in my chest as the charges were read aloud. David glared at me from across the room, his eyes full of venom, but I met his gaze without flinching. Margaret refused to look at me at all, her lips pressed into a thin line. The judge denied their bail, citing both the seriousness of the charges and the overwhelming public interest in the case. For once, their influence and reputation worked against them. The trial was scheduled within 2 months, a speed that surprised even Detective Collins. "The public wants resolution," she explained. "And with the spotlight this bright, no one wants to be accused of dragging their feet." During those weeks leading up to it, I lived in Robert's home, surrounded by the protection of people who cared for me, but the fear lingered. At night, I still heard the sound of the freezer door slamming shut, still felt the icy air clawing at my lungs. Therapy sessions helped me untangle the threads of terror from the determination I carried, but the work was constant. When the trial began, the courthouse steps were lined with cameras. Supporters held signs that read, "Justice for Clara," and "Silence is not survival." A few dissenters stood nearby, too, insisting that family matters should not be public spectacle, but their voices were drowned by the chants of those who believed me, who believed in justice. Inside, the evidence unfolded piece by piece. The recordings played for the jury. David's voice thick with malice, Margaret's cold threats undeniable. Dr. Harper testified with clinical precision, describing the physiological toll of my confinement. The neighbors gave their accounts voices, steady recalling the banging they had heard and the temper they had witnessed in David before. Each testimony built a wall of truth too high for lies to climb. The defense tried everything. They painted me as unstable, as seeking attention. They claimed Robert had manipulated me for his own reasons. They even suggested that my near-death experience had clouded my memory. But each attempt was dismantled by evidence too sharp to dull. The jury watched, listened, and by the end of the second week, their expressions told the story before the verdict was read. David Mitchell was found guilty of attempted murder. Margaret Mitchell was convicted of complicity and obstruction of justice. The sentences were harsh, reflecting not only the severity of the crime, but also the brazenness of the cover-up. David would spend decades behind bars. Margaret faced years herself, her legacy reduced to ashes. As the judge read the sentences, I felt tears stream down my face, not of sadness, but of release. For the first time, the law had stood with me, not against me. For the first time, the family that had silenced me was silenced themselves. Walking out of the courthouse into the cold winter air, I was met with applause from strangers. People who had followed my story, who had seen my pain and my fight. Some reached out to touch my hand, others simply nodded with tears in their eyes. In that moment, I understood something deeper than victory. This was not just about me. This was about every person who had been locked in their own kind of freezer, whether literal or metaphorical, and told to keep quiet. The legal consequences had been delivered, but their impact reached far beyond Margaret and David. The message was clear. Silence could no longer protect abusers. Lies could no longer erase suffering. The world had seen and the world had responded. And I, Clara Mitchell, was finally free. The day after the verdict, I woke up in Robert's house to the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside the frosted windows. For a moment, I lay still, letting the quiet soak into me. No slamming doors, no barking orders, no footsteps pacing with anger. Just silence, and for once it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like a gift. My body was still recovering, my fingers stiff from frostbite, my skin scarred, but something inside me felt newly alive. Dr. Harper came by that afternoon to check on me, even though her official role in my case was over. She sat across from me in Robert's kitchen, her stethoscope looped around her neck, her voice steady. "Clara, your survival was close to impossible. Medically speaking, you shouldn't be here. But you are. Don't waste that miracle." Her words lingered in the air long after she left, both a warning and a promise. The following weeks were a blur of therapy appointments and community support. Detective Collins connected me with a group for women who had survived family violence. I walked into the first meeting nervous, unsure if I belonged. But as I listened to other women speak about bruises hidden under makeup, about gaslighting that made them doubt their own minds about children who had witnessed too much, I realized I was part of something larger. When it was my turn, my voice shook as I said, "My brother locked me in a freezer. My mother told me I deserved it." Gasps echoed around the circle, followed by nods of recognition, not disbelief. One woman reached out, touching my arm gently. "You're safe now," she whispered. That night, I cried harder than I had in months. Not from pain, but from the release of being believed, of being surrounded by people who knew without question what survival demanded. Slowly, I began to rebuild. Robert offered me a permanent place in his home, but he also encouraged me to find independence. "You need roots of your own," he said one evening as we sat by the fire. "Not just shelter, but freedom." His words guided me as I applied for jobs, returned to school part-time, and began carving a life not defined by trauma. Cooking, once a tool of servitude in my family, became a form of healing. I started small soups, breads, simple meals. At first, every chop of a knife, every stir of a pot carried echoes of my mother's criticism or my brother's scorn. But gradually, the kitchen transformed. I invited friends from the support group over and cooked for them, not out of obligation, but out of choice. One evening, as laughter filled Robert's dining room, I realized the difference. This time, I was feeding people who cared about me, who wanted to share joy, not demand perfection. My story continued to ripple outward. The live stream from Robert's house had not faded with the trial. It had become a reference point in local discussions about abuse control and accountability. Schools invited me to speak to students about recognizing warning signs. Churches asked me to share my testimony during awareness events. At first, standing before strangers felt impossible. My hands would tremble, my voice catch. But every time I spoke, someone would approach afterward, eyes shining with tears. "I went through this, too. You gave me courage to finally leave. My daughter needed to hear your story." One evening after a talk, a teenage girl slipped me a note folded into a tiny square. It read, "I see myself in you. I'm going to ask for help." That note became my most treasured possession, tucked into the back of my journal. It reminded me why I kept telling the story even when it hurt to relive it. Therapy forced me to confront my own anger too, the deep reservoir of rage that years of silence had buried. I had hated myself for not escaping sooner, for letting them diminish me. My therapist's voice was gentle but firm. "Clara, you survived in the only ways you knew how. You are not weak for enduring. You are strong for still being here." That shift, seeing survival as strength, not shame, was the beginning of true healing. The town's perception of me shifted as well. For years, I had been the quiet girl in the background, invisible at family events, spoken about but rarely spoken to. Now, neighbors stopped me in the grocery store to say they were proud of me. The Millers who had called the police that night became like second parents. Mrs. Miller would sometimes grab my hands and say, "I thank God every day we heard those sounds." Their presence reminded me that not all family is defined by blood. I also reconnected with Ruby, a cousin who had been quietly pushed out of gatherings years before. She called one evening after watching a news segment about me. "Clara, I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you back then," she said. "I should have spoken up when I saw how they treated you." I told her the truth. We had both been trapped in the same web of silence. Our friendship blossomed again, stitched together by shared survival. By spring, I had moved into a small apartment of my own. It wasn't grand, a one-bedroom with peeling paint and creaky floors, but it was mine. No one controlled when I came home what I cooked or who I invited inside. I painted the walls a warm yellow, planted flowers on the balcony, and filled the shelves with books I had never been allowed to read. Each choice, no matter how small, felt like rebellion against the prison of my past. When the first anniversary of the trial approached, reporters reached out again. This time, I agreed to an interview on my terms. Sitting in front of the camera, I spoke slowly, clearly. Survival isn't just about living through the worst moment. It's about choosing to live after it. My family tried to erase me, but I'm still here. And I'm not invisible anymore. The segment aired on the local news, and the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the country, people who saw themselves in my words. At the support group that week, one woman said, "You're proof that healing isn't just possible, it's powerful." I realized then that my story had moved beyond me. It had become a thread woven into a larger fabric, one that could help others find strength in their own battles. One evening, as I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the city, I felt a peace I had never known. My scars would never vanish, and nightmares still visited sometimes. But those scars were proof of survival, and the nightmares lost their grip each time I spoke them aloud. I had rebuilt not only a life, but a sense of self. Rebirth is not sudden. It is slow, painful, uneven. But piece by piece, I was stitching myself together stronger than before. And as the light faded into twilight, I whispered the truth to myself. I am alive. I am free. I am not afraid of the cold anymore. The year turned quietly, carrying me farther away from the night that nearly killed me and closer to the life I had begun to build. When Thanksgiving came again, it no longer carried dread. Instead of waking before dawn to prepare feasts that swallowed me whole, I woke naturally in my small apartment, sunlight pooling across the yellow walls I had painted myself. The air was cool, scented faintly of the cinnamon rolls I had baked the night before. For the first time in years, the holiday meant freedom. At 11 o'clock, Robert arrived with groceries and his easy smile. "Ready for our small gathering?" he asked, holding up a bag of sweet potatoes. Behind him came the miller's arms full of pies and Ruby carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers. Dr. Harper stopped by, too, her eyes bright with warmth as she set down a bottle of sparkling cider. We were just 8 people in my modest living room, but the space glowed with laughter and conversation. It felt like family, not the one I was born into, but the one I had chosen. We cooked together, moving in a rhythm so different from the chaos I had once endured. Robert mashed potatoes while humming under his breath. Ruby arranged the flowers and teased me for choosing yellow walls that matched my curtains. Dr. Harper, apron tied clumsily, burned the first batch of rolls and laughed until tears streaked her cheeks. And I, no longer the invisible servant, no longer silenced, stood at the stove, not burdened but joyful, stirring soup as I wanted, seasoned to my taste. At 2 o'clock, we sat down to eat. The table was simple turkey vegetables soup bread. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress, but every dish held love. As plates were passed, we took turns sharing what we were grateful for. Robert said he was grateful for second chances. The Millers said they were grateful for courage. Ruby said she was grateful to feel welcome again. When it was my turn, I looked around the table, my throat tight. I'm grateful for survival, for freedom, and for learning that family is not defined by blood, but by care. The words settled into the room like a benediction. Later that evening, as twilight crept across the city, I set up my phone on the kitchen counter. My hands trembled a little, but I was ready. "You don't have to do this tonight," Robert said softly, sensing my nerves. I shook my head. "I need to. This is the right time." I opened a live stream, something I had been preparing for weeks. Within minutes, hundreds of viewers joined. Their names scrolled across the screen, comments blinking into existence. I took a deep breath and began. My name is Clara Mitchell. Some of you know my story because it went viral last year. Some of you don't. I survived being locked in a freezer by my own brother while my mother stood by. I survived 2 minutes without a heartbeat. I survived the lies and the silence that followed. And I'm here to tell you that survival is not enough. Healing is possible. Justice is possible. And no one deserves to be invisible in their own family. The comments poured in immediately. "We stand with you, Clara. You're a miracle. I went through this too. Thank you for speaking up." My chest ached with a mix of grief and gratitude as I continued. I used to think my worth depended on serving others, on being quiet, on never complaining, on making everything perfect. But when perfection nearly cost me my life, I realized the truth. Family isn't who locks you in the cold. Family is who keeps you safe when life freezes you out. The flood of comments grew. Supporters wrote messages like, You gave me courage to leave my abusive family, and my sister suffered the same, and now I see her pain differently. But alongside them came other voices, sharp and skeptical. Why air family dirty laundry online? She should have left years ago. This is just attention seeking. For a moment, the sting of those words pricked deep. But I steadied myself, remembering therapy, remembering the support group, remembering that healing meant facing all voices, not only the kind ones. I know some of you think I should have left earlier, I said into the camera, my voice calm. But leaving isn't always simple. Fear is a prison. Silence is a weapon. And sometimes survival means staying until you can't anymore. If you've never been there, I hope you never have to understand. And if you have, I want you to know you're not alone. The comment section shifted as people defended me against the critics. Don't blame the victim. You're brave for speaking truth. Ignore the noise, we believe you. The swell of solidarity drowned out the few who tried to undermine me. Midway through the live stream, the number of viewers doubled, then tripled. Friends shared the link. Local news picked it up, streaming my words on their websites. By the time I finished, over 30,000 people had tuned in. Some were survivors, some were allies, some were just curious, but all of them had heard my voice, unfiltered and unbroken. As I closed the live stream, tears blurred my vision. Robert pulled me into a hug. "You did it," he whispered. "You took back the story." I nodded against his shoulder, relief and exhaustion mingling. This time I said it was on my terms. In the days that followed, messages flooded my inbox. Survivors wrote long letters about their own journeys. One said, "I left my husband today because you gave me the push I needed." Another said, "Your story saved my daughter. She showed me your video and finally told me the truth." Even strangers who had never known abuse wrote to thank me for opening their eyes. There were still critics, of course. Anonymous posts mocking me, saying I was dramatic, that families fight all the time. But their voices were drowned by the overwhelming tide of compassion. For every cruel comment, there were dozens of kind ones. For every shadow, a light. Months later, when I walked into the support group, women greeted me not as a victim, but as a leader. "Your live stream changed everything," one said. "People are talking about us now, not hiding us." It was then I realized that my story had moved beyond me. It had become part of a collective fight, a chorus of voices demanding to be heard. On the anniversary of my survival, I returned to the freezer. It stood empty now, rusting in the garage of the old house, its lock broken. Standing before it, I placed my hand on the cold metal. "You didn't win," I whispered. The echo of my breath lingered in the air, but it no longer carried fear, only defiance, only strength. That night back in my apartment, I lit a single candle on the windowsill. Outside, snow fell silently, blanketing the world in white. Inside, warmth spread through me, steady and unshakable. I thought of Dr. Harper's words. "Don't waste that miracle," and knew I hadn't. I ended the year with a promise whispered into the quiet room. "I will keep speaking. I will keep living. And I will never disappear again."